It's the System Failure Podcast, number 82.
Hey, Brian, how are you doing this fine morning?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. We're getting a snowstorm up here in Maine. Today is, March 29th, I believe is the date. So it is, we get a April Fool's storm every year. And even though April 1st is still a couple days away, let us hope that this is that April Fool's storm and we can move on into spring after this in earnest. Hey, Brian?
Well, this is the snowstorm you prophesized in System Failure number 81.
I guess I did, yeah. I have no one but myself to blame in that case, huh?
Yeah.
Ugh. Well, I will say it was nice to wake up to the snow billowing this morning. It was very picturesque. I don't ever get tired of that, no matter how much I get tired of shoveling the driveway. And so it was very easy to believe in magic on mornings like these, eh?
Well, I mean, there's something to be said about the prophesizing and manifestation that brought the snowstorm to fruition.
Yeah, I guess that's another. I was talking about the magic just of like the white, the world being all different and transformed. But you're right, having, called this snowstorm into existence, which you're now saying I'd forgotten that I had done, and which you're now reminding me of. So that's another added layer of magic. And magic is going to be, of course, the major theme of this show. Brian will be coming back to magic in the second half. So that will be very interesting.
Well, anyway, 4 inches of snow is like icing on the cake, or it's not a crazy amount to have to shovel anyway.
Yeah,
and
yes.
It doesn't really disrupt anyone's plans, especially when we're all grizzled veterans at this point, having dealt with a long winter.
Well, I usually cheat on shoveling on the April Fool's storm.
Oh, yeah.
Just kind of let it ride. If it's not too many inches, just kind of let it ride and know that we're going to get back to 40, 50 degree weather in short order here, and then it'll all be melting. So I intend to be lazy to the max with respect to shoveling this storm, which, remains to be seen whether or not it is the April Fool's storm, but yeah.
All right. Well, what an exciting system failure goings-ons have you been ruminating about this week, Nate?
Well, this week I have, as an article of the week, a story about the ongoing tariffs roiling the markets. I think when I last looked on Friday afternoon, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was down some 600 points again. And so this article relates to that. But I'm still wondering what is going on here. Like, the Donald must have known that announcing and unannouncing and re-announcing all these tariffs would roil the markets. He must think that he's going to gain something politically from this. Or is this just total kleptocracy, and what's going to happen is that everyone's just going to, all of the big money's just going to steal everything that's not nailed down, that hasn't already been stolen, and that's just the phase of empire collapse we're in. I don't know. Do you think that Donald has any kind of a cogent plan for this? It seems to me the best, if I want to give the Donald as much credit as possible, it seems to me that he's trying to leverage this petrodollar advantage that we have. With the U.S. being the world reserve currency, we have the privilege of accepting all kinds of junk into our ports, via container ships, and then shipping out our funny monopoly money in the other direction. And so I think that Donald thinks that he can increase the flow of junk flowing into our harbors, right? But with some brinksmanship here, maybe in other words, he thinks that we can take our advantage where we rip off the rest of the world and make them pay for their own military encirclement and press that advantage even further and get even more goodies for our funny monopoly money. That might be but I don't know. I can't really, I think ultimately the problem is that go ahead.
Well, the plan must be to import less junk, right? With the raising of tariffs and whatnot. And maybe we can export our junk and take other people's less funny money.
Yeah, I guess that's an obvious point. You're right. We're trying to repatriate. So you think the Donald? Well, the issue with that theory is that in order to see the economic growth from repatriating all of our offshoring, it's going to take 5-10 years. I mean, that's just not something that Donald's going to be able to ever reap any political benefit for. So that can't be the plan, can it?
That's just what I was thinking in my head as you were going on that diatribe there, is that, I think the plan sort of makes sense, but it's one that would take a long time to put into effect. So, knowing the fickle political, appetite of the American populace, or it seems like it's going to be a hard plan to execute.
That's what makes me think maybe this is just the kleptocracy business kicking in, right? The Donald doesn't have to run for re-election, and he knows it. And so now it's just going to be the Donald, and everyone who has appropriately demonstrated loyalty to the Donald is just going to pillage our dying economy now. I don't know. is the plan to, is the situation out of the Donald's control, and is the market reaction, wanting to pull the overvalued stock market when there's someone who has been opposed to the establishment in power at the moment? I don't know.
Well, to be fair to the Donald, the time to have everyone in doubt is kind of now and not at the end of his presidency. I mean, assuming he wants sort of his regime to continue with like J.D. Vance or someone like that. Now is the time for uncertainty rather than like at the end.
Well, that's true. I just don't see how he's going to be able to bring those horses back into the barn. But obviously, we're not privy to the Donald's plans here on the Old System Failure podcast. So I suppose all we can do is watch, wait, and read the Wall Street Journal to learn as much as we can in the meantime, eh?
Well, there was like talk about, removing taxes for tips, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, like that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And then there's also talk about like not taxing people who make under 150K, and that hasn't happened yet. Now, so supposing that Donald accomplishes some of those things, I think he'll win back some of the American populace, eh? But also, I don't know, like it seems like the war in the Middle East is like business as usual, or like blowing shit up in Yemen or whatever.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard seemed like a person of integrity prior to being brought in. And so maybe, I guess I just have to imagine that there's no way that you can be, I don't know the exact name of her position, but, in
Director of National Intelligence, DNI.
Yeah, in charge of blowing shit up in the Middle East. There's probably just no way to get that job and not blow stuff up over there.
If you thought that you could pull the lever for the Donald and not multiply our already tiresome and laborious foreign entanglements, why, you were sorely mistaken, eh?
But at the beginning, though, like for a hot minute there, it seemed like he was going to be putting a lot of pressure on Israel. But I don't know, Israel, it seems like there's like no ceasefire, right?
Yeah, they're back at it. And this past week, I think it was last weekend now, they resumed bombing in earnest in Gaza, resulting in the death of hundreds. So doesn't seem like a ton of improvement on the foreign policy front.
But, I mean, it's been like, 2 months, and I'm sure it's not easy to get in there and change things. So, I mean, I don't know. I guess we just have to hope that the Donald is trying to make positive change and that the plan is not to steal everything that's nailed down.
Well, the Wall Street Journal reporters found the Donald in his office this week, threatening automakers to not raise prices on cars as a result of these tariffs here. And that is, in fact, what the article here is entitled. Do
you have some exciting selections for us?
I do, yeah. I'll read a digested version of the article here. This article is headlined, Trump warned U.S. automakers not to raise prices in response to tariffs. And the subheadline reads, threat came in a call earlier this month in which car makers feared punishment if prices go up. And this is written by Josh Dawsey and Orion Felton of the Wall Street Journal. And a selection of the text goes a little something like this. When President Trump convened CEOs of some of the country's top automakers for a call earlier this month, he issued a warning. They better not raise car prices because of tariffs. Trump told the executives that the White House would look unfavorably on such a move, leaving some of them rattled and worried they would face punishment if they increased prices, people with knowledge of the call said. On Wednesday, Trump announced a 25% tariff on all imported vehicles and parts, starting April 2nd, a move almost certain to force American car makers to raise prices on customers. Most automakers depend on parts and materials from other countries to make cars, including vehicles assembled in the U.S. It is unclear what the Trump administration could do if automakers raise their prices. Trump has targeted disfavored law firms with executive orders, and automakers rely on federal regulators for critical approvals. An executive at one of the automakers said they were baffled by the desire to both impose tariffs but also tell car companies they couldn't raise prices. Quote, the math would tell you that's going to cost us multi-billions of dollars, the executive said. So who pays for that? Unquote. Well, that's the reason that this article caught my eye is because it reminds me of Richard Nixon freezing prices in the summer of 1971. This incident, Brian, which I think I may have talked about on this podcast earlier, was basically with a major inflation in the early 70s. Nixon sought to combat inflation, which, as we saw with the recent election, is a killer at the polls. He went on TV and announced that there would be a 90-day moratorium on raising prices of anything, including wages, and that anyone who raised prices would be, sent to jail. They would be a crime. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that Richard Nixon is a hardcore conservative Republican. He was a hardcore conservative Republican president. And it's just interesting to me how much, we don't talk about that as a tool in our toolbox anymore, post the free market, championing of Ronald Reagan in the 80s. We don't even talk about the possibility of just, of violating the free market and mandating what prices can be and getting rid of inflation manually. Now, I think it's worth noting that it didn't really work that well, in no small part thanks to the oil embargo of 1973. You may recall, Brian, that the Israelis had captured a bunch of Israeli and Syrian territory in the 1967 war, where they got the whole Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, and then in 1973, Egypt and Syria sneak attacked Israel, the Yom Kippur War, and so they were in hostilities with the Israelis, and we were supporting the Israelis, so we got our oil cut off by the Arab OPEC nations, causing gas prices to skyrocket and totally making Nixon's policy fail. But it's just interesting that in our current day and age, when we have an inflation the only solution we have, there's nothing we can do for an inflation except have the Fed jack up rates, dry up new businesses, dry up business expansion, and basically drive up unemployment, drive down prices by putting people out of work. That seems to be our one and only tool in our toolbox these days. It's just really interesting to note that back when old Tricky Dick was president, there were more tools in our toolbox, despite the fact that the man was conservative as all hell, eh? So that's what this article has me thinking about, Brian.
I guess it seems questionable to me. I mean, I think the good part of capitalism is letting the market kind of dictate the prices for things.
So I just really want to make sure we distinguish between capitalism, which is an ownership structure, and a market, which is a distribution scheme. That you don't have to have.
All right. I guess
they don't go together.
I guess the free market would be a better way to describe it. And it seems like if you don't let people raise prices in response to increasing costs, it's like a recipe for shortages and no food at the grocery store. Yeah,
I think that for goods that there are unless you're like an Austrian school type, even the most free market of economists will acknowledge the existence of the public good, this thing that the market doesn't work well for. Hospitals are a good one, healthcare. When you're in the ambulance, with a compound fracture, you're not going to be comparing prices. So there's just no way, right? So there's no way for the price mechanism to work. And goods that are non-excludable, like national defense, are another example. There's just no way that you can bill people individually for national defense. It's just not. It just doesn't work that way. And so, with respect to goods that do make sense to distribute on a free market, I'm inclined to agree with you, Brian. We should have the free market when and where and when it's applicable. And monkeying with the free market, it certainly didn't work for Nixon. And it's not that it would work today. I just noticed it's just that we have. It really shows the sort of brainwashing that we are a victim of with respect to economics in this country, that no one talks about the possibility of doing what Nixon did. You see the Donald's flirting with it here, right? Because he's threatening these people with punishment if they raise their prices. So he's kind of channeling his inner, Richard Nixon here. But I just think it's very interesting to note that what once was politically viable is now off the table as an option. Very telling, I think, anyway.
Well, it is. It's on the table, apparently.
Well, I don't think. We'll see. I guess maybe you're right. We don't There was no when we had inflation during the COVID pandemic, right? The idea of fixing prices was never part of the discussion ever. It was always, is the Fed going to raise rates? What they did, right? Jack up rates to try to curb the inflation, and that was how they tried to battle the inflation that they first identified as transitory, as you may recall.
Well, I can just imagine what Donald Trump would say if the government came to him and it's there's a housing shortage and people can't afford homes, so we're going to need to regulate the prices on your luxury, apartments and whatnot, and make them affordable to, your average Joe.
Yeah, so that would be direct price fixing. What you could do is make it illegal for any entity to own 2 houses or 3 houses. You just jack up the taxes on each additional house beyond the first, or just banish people who aren't like corporations from owning homes. You could do that. There's all kinds of ways that we could. I do think that our problems are easily fixable, but all those problems involve taking money where it's pooling up from the rich and redistributing it to the poor in an effort to lengthen the runway of capitalism here. But that's not politically viable. So what would be effective is not price increases, not price fixing, but taxing property instead of labor, right? Taxing wealth instead of labor, and restoring the circular flow of money through the economy that way. And it worked for FDR in the 30s, and I posit it would work again today.
Well, I guess it all doesn't. I'm not optimistic that the Democrats aren't just going to continue to run their neoliberal strategy and be able to get away with it.
Well, that's really it, isn't it? We have one party. We have like the sort of blame for like the Republicans, when their policies fail, can always run again further to the right. But we've blocked the left from moving to the left because of our overturned window of acceptable economic policies, the trajectory of which we're discussing right now. And so the centrists, we'll just try to be a little more, I don't really know what the Democratic proposal is for the disappearance of the middle class. There isn't one, right? It's why they are catastrophically unpopular at the polls and are doomed to always be catastrophically unpopular at the polls until such time as they actually propose some economic remedies from the middle and lower classes whom they are supposed to represent.
Well, I think maybe like one source of optimism is that at least like the Snow White movie is like bombed at
I heard that,
and so no one's going to see this movie, and so there is like this cultural change afoot, and so like Disney's gonna have to make movies that respond to the cultural zeitgeist somehow, and like these superhero movies and girl boss movies aren't really cutting it, and so someone's gonna have to address the matter in some way, and the zeitgeist is gonna it's gonna manifest itself somehow in culture, and as that happens, I guess. It's just not, the change isn't going to come overnight. And so, I don't know, maybe Donnie Trump is not is not our savior, but I think if the libs run again, it can't quite be the same neoliberal strategy, right? They're going to have to respond to the cultural zeitgeist somehow, right?
You would think so. It does seem like the way that the Democrats managed to muster the few votes that they got, since Obama, has been leaning into the, for lack of a better word, woke zeitgeist. But now that there's a backlash against that, they're going to need something else. And I don't know. I think I would like to think that that they would just see no way forward, right, and be like, all right, fine, we're going to have to renounce our corporate donors and actually represent the lower and middle classes. I guess it's really hard to picture that happening, but we got to elevate our discourse as their target constituency amongst each other, I suppose, and not accept any imposters. If the plan has no real redress of our economic plight, then we shouldn't accept it, and hopefully we won't. And hopefully they will pivot hopefully they've already got the rebuke that they need to pivot, but it does seem unlikely, doesn't it, Brian?
Yeah. I guess what I'd like to have happen is like someone needs to go on Joe Rogan who's like not part of Trump's cabinet, and like who can kind of effectively criticize both parties or something, or like we need to get you on the Joe Rogan pod.
Well, he should have Dr. Michael Hudson on the pod. That guy that would be an unbelievable unbelievable segment. Rick Wolf has gone on the Lex Friedman pod. Hasn't Hudson been on it also? Maybe not. But it would be nice to hear some of the champions of the battered and marginalized the real economic left. It'd be nice to hear some of them. They certainly are out there. But Rogan does seem more interested in having on the tech bros who support the Donald's platform these days, much to our chagrin, eh?
Well, I'm sure that like Joe Rogan will have to notice if it's like not working out at some point, and I'm sure he'll look for that kind. He'll be looking for someone to fill that void.
Yeah.
Yep.
One final note: you mentioned Cinderella, and that
Snow White.
Yes, Snow White. Sorry, I'm mixing up my princesses here. It is interesting to me that there is like no art that reflects the withdrawal of the lower and middle classes that our generations are living through, or at least none from the corporate boardrooms. And so, yeah, it does seem like Disney, they're supposed to be this great production studio for great works of art, but they're part of the problem. They're part of the bleeding dry of the middle and lower classes. I mean, their ticket prices at Disney, example 1A. And so they can't really reflect that reality. And so they're left just kind of rehashing stories of yesteryear over and over and over again to no one's applause. And, that South Park really told the story with that. A couple years ago with, make it gay and make it lame, whatever that thing was.
What's the lady, Cynthia?
I forgot. She's since resigned her post down there at Disney, but she was the creative director responsible for a lot of these unimaginative, uncreative travesties foisted upon us by the mouse.
But yeah, you see Disney World completely abandoning the middle class and just catering to people who are already rich. And yeah.
Well, it's the story of our time, but they don't want to tell it. Well, should we go into the break here, Brian, and come back with a lively discussion of magic stemming from our podcast of the week?
Well, we can tease it this way. I mean, I guess, we have some kind of intelligent discussion about magic thanks to Paul Horowitz.
Mitch Horowitz.
Yeah. He has something intelligent to say about magic, which I think is relevant and important and is maybe like another it's something that they should be adopted into the zeitgeist, or it's something to grow into. So that'll be exciting. Huh?
Yep, lots to say about that, so don't go away. We'll be right back in just a second.
All right.
And we're back. Alrighty, Brian, well, here it is, magic time. Now, I initially went to college for like rocket science, university. Like that's what I was like in the mid 2000s. I was excited about the hardcore atheist movement. I think you were excited about it too, Brian, back in the day? Like Sam Harris and Chris Hitchens and those guys.
Well, nothing's better than listening to Sam Harris and... Did Chris Hitchens also debate Rabbi Shmuley?
Oh, yeah, he certainly did.
Yeah, all right. That was exciting YouTube content back in like 2004.
Yeah, I was talking about my debate with my old college girlfriend about how loudly I was blasting, Shmuley Boteach's bleeding in our apartment. So that was a source of contention, unfortunately.
You also had some delightful arguments with our parents about atheism.
I'll never forget, I remember the date that I discovered new atheism because it was the same day as the night that the Anaheim Ducks won the Cup in 2007. Sean Thornton and the Niedermeyers. That
Who
crew.
can forget?
Yeah. And I remember after the game, I was up late on YouTube because I discovered Dr. Harris giving us all permission to criticize religion. It was off the table, a rational discussion, but he awarded me permission. He literally said you can't, get in the elevator and notice someone's crucifix necklace and start in on them. You can't go home and berate friends and family. But that's exactly what I did. I took it home and berated friends and family nonstop. I really thought, this materialism is such a simple conception. The scientific paradigm of materialism, such a simple conception, and those who believe in other paradigms are ridiculous and deluded fools. But it makes me think of like the people living their lives in the Middle Ages, just believing whatever the church told them, and being like, only a fool would dare, question this. This conception of reality, the Catholic conception of reality. And well, that's what I felt about the scientific materialist paradigm. So it does feel ironic, and I don't feel like super cool now having to come on podcasts like this one and be like, all right, well, I cracked some history books, and it seems like maybe we should be taking this magic thing a little more seriously than we have been. It does seem like it's the political authorities who are at all times and places denouncing the magic. And that's ironic because oftentimes the political authorities rose to power being magicians themselves. So that's something that's a bailiwick we're always getting into here on system failure. And so I've just been noticing more and more people now coming out and saying that same thing. There's Kurt Metzger, the sidekick character on Jimmy Dore's show, who used to be a normie like me, like you, Brian. But now he goes on, makes the podcast rounds, and he's like us. He's jacked. He's all excited and jacked up. He's talking about things at a breakneck speed. But he's talking about his punchline I've heard come out of his mouth over and over again in the past year is that there's the scientists, and then there's the people who pay for the scientific grants. And the scientists assure us plebes of a strictly materialist worldview, but meanwhile, the people who fund their science are out at eyes wide shut ceremonies, sacrificing to Baal at Bohemian Grove, believing in all kinds of crazy things. And so that's your first clue that as the banks rose to power during the Industrial Revolution, that they invoked all of this weird Egyptian magical symbology, like the Freemasons or like the Washington Monument or that's a whole other rabbit hole we can go down. But the point is that Kurt Metzger is always talking about how people who fund the scientific grants believe in magic, and maybe we ought to take it seriously on those grounds. And then there's Professor Richard Spence out of the University of Idaho, who writes books on the history of secret societies and magic, just like the history of them, talking about how even things like a pep rally fit the definition of a magical ritual, and we should be realizing that more of our past is magical than the authorities would like us to believe. And so that brings me to a third figure now, this Mitch Horowitz, who has a whole bibliography of books about magic, and he has a recent one that's come out, Practical Magick.
With a K at the end.
With a K, yeah, Magick, Practical Magick. Ancient Tradition and Modern Practice is the subheading, and this book just came out in the past couple of weeks.
And he's got a delightful picture like a crow with the hexagram on it there. Yeah, it seems very magical.
Yes.
Well, I just remember 50 episodes or so ago on the System Failure podcast, we were talking about the importance of magic, but we didn't seem to have ideas about how to do it, or at least that's how I felt. And I felt we were somewhat at a creative dead end in that way.
Well, I know why you're bringing this up. Our last clip of this one is going to be a suggestion from Mr. Horowitz on exactly how a magical ritual, how we could actually use magic in your own life. We'll see. I don't know. Interesting stuff.
Yeah, I definitely want to read his book. It sounds exciting and creatively nurturing.
Yeah. It certainly promises to be interesting and not boring, if absolutely nothing else, eh?
Yeah. Well, this podcast he did with Duncan Trussell here.
Yeah.
Number 675 is a banger.
Yeah. So this is the Duncan Trussell Family Hour. We all know Duncan Trussell is the lovable sidekick to Rogan. Wasn't he the doorman or something at the comedy club for years or something like that?
Oh, that's how they first met.
Yeah.
He's got that raspy lesbian voice.
Yeah. He does sound like a raspy lesbian. And he had that Duncan. What was the name of the Netflix show he had? The weird Netflix show, animated Netflix show. It might also have been the Duncan Trussell Family Hour, and this might be the Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast. Is that possible?
Man, it definitely had a different. I don't think it had. I think it had a different name, but it was cobbled together from his interviews with some crazy animations. It was the Midnight Gospel. That's what it was called.
You got it, Brian. The Midnight Gospel. Very good. Well, what do you think? Should we just dive right into clip number one, where Mitch Horowitz will now talk about the science?
We as a human community
Here we go.
keep on amassing data upon data upon data that doesn't fit with classical physics, that doesn't fit with Newtonian mechanics, never mind the fact that Isaac Newton himself was an alchemist. So I think he'd be delighted with all this. He wouldn't feel that somehow he was being overturned. He would feel that we're now appropriately standing on his shoulders. Yeah. We're seeing things that don't work. We're seeing things that don't fit. Perfect example that's come out in recent weeks. Google announced that its quantum computing prototype called Willow solved an equation so problematic that it would have taken 10 septillion years, which is longer than the entire projected span of humanity. Right. So where did the answer come from? So Google's engineers wrote, well, this speaks in favor of the interdimensional thesis. In other words, maybe Willow was able to pluck this answer from another intersection of time or another dimension. Right. And that might sound very far out, very heady, but the fact is, where did the answer come from if, according to the team's calculations, getting this answer, which they procured in, I believe it was less than 5 minutes, would otherwise take 10 septillion years. Right. And that's a time frame that, strictly speaking, does not exist. It does not exist. Right. So dig it. What's so fascinating is that we as a public are not even yet exposed to these programs. They're in beta launch. AI is in beta.
Right.
Quantum computing is in proto launch, and unless you work somewhere at Google or at a lab or maybe at the upper echelons of high finance, you don't even have access to this stuff. So it seems very far out to us.
Yeah.
It's going to become less and less far out as time passes. Just as we don't feel the earth turning, but we know indelibly that it is.
Right.
Whether it's a black hole, a simulation, a multiverse, we simply don't live under the umbrella of Newtonian mechanics alone. We might live under that little umbrella, but there's something going on outside that orderly intimacy. And we've known this really since Einstein, who proved through his relativity theories, which have since been validated through experiments, that time itself is not linear. Time bends in conditions of a black hole, extreme gravity. Time bends in conditions of extreme velocity, at or near light speed. And it's so funny because when you talk about time moving backwards, people howl against that. The arrow of time goes one way. Yeah. You can't break an egg. Einstein's second law of thermodynamics. All true, all true. But that's classical physics. That's Newtonian mechanics. Quantum mechanics, in fact, does show things moving backwards. There's a particle called a positron, which has been demonstrated since 1947 by the great Richard Feynman to move backwards in time, literally.
There you go. Okay, so just a couple of points of order here. Positron, right? I remember this from Star Trek because Data has a positronic matrix, but a positron is merely the inverse of an electron. So an electron has a negative charge, a positron has a positive charge. And this man is talking here about Newtonian mechanics and relativity. And the relationship between Newtonian mechanics and relativity, Newtonian mechanics, we all understand, that's where your cart, you take a weighted cart and drop it down a track, like a Pinewood Derby, and you can calculate when it will reach the end because you've got all these equations. And Einstein came along in the early part of the 20th century and said, oh, that's well and good. Well, so the Newtonian paradigm, according to Einstein, is an example, a special example of general relativity. So you've got special relativity, which is Newtonian mechanics, and then you've got general relativity, which is Einstein's broader theory that space and time are part of the same manifold, that their apparent separation is merely an illusion. So that really cuts to what the heart, that to me really cuts to what the heart we talk about when we're talking about magic.
Well, I like this idea. I mean, it is funny to think about how the AI we're dealing with is just the beta, and there's probably a much more sophisticated AI that other people have access to, and I don't know. We're really in for it, I think, in the near future.
Have you ever heard of Dr. Eric Weinstein's? He invokes this idea of a soft or a quiet sunset. Have you heard this line from him before, Brian?
It doesn't ring a bell based on your description there.
The idea here is that when you have some of these big organizations, when it comes time for someone to retire or when it comes time to part way with someone for some reason, rather than terminating the person and embarrassing them publicly, what you might do is give them a soft sunset, which means that they get assigned, they continue working and they still think they're in their old role, but the important work is now going to someone else, unbeknownst to the person who's being sunsetted here. And Weinstein's theory is that that's what happened to the physics community when they discovered that general relativity itself is nested within some broader framework, right? So in other words, Einstein thinks that what we discovered in the years after the atom bomb, 50s and 60s, was whatever they discovered would do to Einsteinian physics what Einsteinian physics did to Newtonian physics, right? The new paradigm, in other words. And Weinstein wonders if, like, the scientific community with which he's intimately familiar, being a mathematician, being one of these elite mathematicians who knows all of the muckety mucks in this field, he's wondering if they didn't discover that this reality really is an illusion in the Platonic sense, and that the scientists can't really come out and make that announcement, right? Right. Obviously, if the clipboard and white lab coat people hold a press conference and announce that the reality that we live in is an illusion, well, that's going to have major knock-on effects. People aren't going to go to work anymore. The economy grinds to a halt. Like, who wants to go to a wretched job if the scientists are announcing the job is merely some kind of an illusion? It's like that's a scientific discovery they cannot simply announce. And so maybe the physicists, only a few physicists are in on this, and then the rest of the scientific community got soft sunsetted, and that's why we're going round and round with string theory that barely makes any sense and doesn't make any projections, and explains why. I saw a picture online of the Concorde, the supersonic jet, and a Spitfire, the English airplane that defended the coast of the White Cliffs of Dover during the Battle of Britain. And the Spitfire and the Concorde were flying side by side, and the caption was like only 39 years between the first flight of the Spitfire and the first flight of the Concorde, which is unbelievable when you think about the improvement. But we've kind of come to we haven't seen that kind of innovation in the second half of the 20th century that we did in the first half of the 20th century, and maybe this could be why. Yeah, something is up in the halls of science, and their materialist conception leaves a lot to be desired, which is what I would have my 20-year-old self would have hated to admit.
Well, it was really funny what you were saying before about the people funding the scientific research are warp shipping Bayou.
Yeah. But the research they're funding tells us that we must believe in a very narrow, constricted, materialist conception of reality,
and therefore you must keep slaving away at the fry later at the Popeyes or whatever.
Yeah, get back to work. All right. Well, speaking of narrow avenues, we're going to hear a little more now about retrocausality and about what's really going on with this bizarre phenomenon we call time. So, Brian, if you would, clip numero dos.
I have a lot of affection for the work of a Cornell research psychologist named Darrell Bem. Bem spent 10 years on a paper that he released in 2011 on the subject of retrocausality. And in short, he made the case, backed up with stats up to your eyeballs, that if you study for a test in the so-called future, it can subtly but trackably increase your score in the so-called present. Sounds ridiculous. Everybody wants to argue with it.
That's cool.
Everybody wants to argue with it. A decade on, Bem's data was meta-analyzed and proved confirmatory in an analysis of 90 experiments in 33 different labs in 14 different nations. How's that for replication? Replication of ESP is supposed to not exist.
But maybe you could elaborate on this, on what he means by that. Study for a test in the future.
By all means. In his most innovative experiments, Bem basically gave subjects a word list to memorize and then asked them to recite back whatever they could remember. So let's say you're given a word list of 10 words, and then you're told, okay, Duncan, now what do you remember? You might remember 6 out of 10, 5 out of 10, something like that. In any case, then he tried a different wrinkle in the experiment, and the subjects were asked to continue their memorization. They gave their recitation, but then in certain cases they were asked to continue their memorization into the future. Those subjects that continued their recitation into the so-called future, which is just a conceptual term, really, spiked a score of 2% higher or so, again and again and again.
Okay, wait. So
tens of thousands of trials.
So a group of people are given this test. There's a median score, and then there's some people who scored a little bit better on the test. The test has been done, but you randomize and you select this group and that group, and then of that group, some of them are told to study into the future, and there is a correlation between higher scores and those that were told to study into the future.
Correct.
And that's fucking batshit.
Batshit, right?
That is so hard to wrap your head around. It's so crazy.
I remember I was talking to the religious studies chair at Rice, and she was asking me to repeat this. This is a woman, wonderful woman, April DeConnick, dedicated her life to esoteric studies. It's like, let me get this shit straight, because it goes against everything that we understand as real. It undermines our whole sense of reality, that time is this circular spiral.
Yeah.
It's not this arrow of time. And people will excoriate me for having said this. Like, what the fuck? There you go, you woo-meisters again, blah, 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 blah. We don't make the rules of science. Science is methodological replication. I'm just the messenger. This paper was produced This paper was proven confirmatory in a really large-scale meta-analysis in different nations using different languages over the course of 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. So you can really. I've not heard that study before, but that is fascinating. This idea that time, that we are at the stage now where we can demonstrate that time is not what we think it is. It is not what we experience it as. So I was really interested in that study of retrocausality, as mentioned by Mr. Mitch Horowitz there. So the last two clips here are more about how to. One of them is about retrocausality in action to demonstrate the point, and then the last one is about how can you wield magic in your own life. But before we get to those two clips, I just want to briefly paint a few strokes of the history of magic here, because it really shows the time element, I think, if you stop and think about Platonism a little more carefully. Now, Brian, I think the year that Plato published his Allegory of the Cave in Book 7 of the Republic was 375 BC. We've been talking about it ever since. I know you read the Republic in college. And it's like become a cliche, the Allegory of the Cave, elucidated therein. It's in every Philosophy 101 course that every freshman has to take at every college in the land. But if you examine the tired cliche, there really is there's a reason that this idea obsessed Greco-Roman society, why it had such a major influence on Christianity, and why we need to have another stop and go back to Platonism and have another look at it, just as the Medici and the Florentines did during the Renaissance here.
Well, the basic idea of the Allegory of the Cave are, people just understand it as like a metaphor for trying to get other people to understand some kind of greater idea.
Yeah.
But I mean, really though, it's something more fundamental about the nature of reality of itself, right?
Yes,
is
absolutely.
why it's such a fascinating tale.
Can you briefly give us the Allegory of the Cave, Brian, as you remember it from your Philosophy 101?
Well, basically, there are some people chained to like the wall on the side of a cave, and that they're seeing some shadows projected by a light from above, and people consider the shadows to be real. But then someone, escapes from their bondage and goes outside the cave and is trying to relay to goes back in and tries to explain that there's something outside the cave to the people chained to the wall, but they reject it.
You've got it. Yeah, that's exactly it. The prisoners are chained in such a way that they can't look around. They can only face this wall of the cave, and on the wall of the cave is like a shadow puppet show. I went back and looked at the text. It just says that unseen figures hold up objects, in front of a great fire, and that those are the shadows on the wall. So really unclear who the unseen figures would be. But the point is that Plato's saying that reality, the physical world, is like that shadow puppet flickering on the wall of the cave, and that it's easy to mistake that for actual reality. But there's a broader reality of outside of that. And in much the way that like Newtonian physics is nested within Einsteinian physics, right? The physical world is nested within this much broader reality. And so Plato made this distinction between the physical world we live in, the matrix, as it were, and then this other realm, this realm of forms or ideas. That's what he called it, right? And you perceive that with the mind. I always like the fist clenching analogy. I know I'm always dusting it off for this podcast, but let me do it one more time, right? Into Plato, there's two worlds: the place where you decide to make a fist, your mind, and the place where your hand actually closes, the illusory physical world. All that's well and good, right? This idea is connected to the mystery schools. Plato was someone who would have been initiated into the mysteries of Eleusis, and let's see, according to Diogenes Laertius, the biographer, he and the playwright, not Achilles, Euripides, traveled to Egypt together and were initiated into the Egyptian mysteries there. And the idea of this reality being an illusory one is one that is always a feature of the old mystery schools, where they would do psychoactive drugs and dissolve this reality, thus proving that it's that we have a hand in creating it versus us just being a little mind moving around inside a broader creation. But the point is Platonism, right? We get this the key to understanding Neoplatonism. So that first brick is Platonism, right? And we got this next brick on top. But Neoplatonism, this is the Platonism of the Roman Empire. So a later version of Platonism. And to understand Neoplatonism, you just have to see that Plato, in his allegory of the cave, he invokes dimensionality, right? He is saying that this reality is like your shadow on the square of a sidewalk, and that true reality, this realm of forms, has the same relationship to our illusory physical reality that your shadow on the sidewalk has to your physical body that's casting that shadow, right? He's literally using shadows in his allegory of the cave. And all you have to do is say, well, okay, so the two-dimensional shadow and there's three-dimensional me. Well, that arrangement implies a hierarchy, right? Obviously, the three-dimensional reality where your body actually exists is a higher order reality than the 2D shadow. The Neoplatonists slapped another figure in there, the one, the source where all this comes from. So there's the perfect realm of ideas emanating from the one, and then there's the physical world emanating from the perfect realm of ideas. This was the Neoplatonic Trinity, and it is where Christianity got its version of the Trinity from. And the history here is really interesting because this idea of the Trinity was at the heart of the Arian, the major schism in the early Christian church in the 3rd century, right? The Arian conspiracy, the Arian heresy, as it was called. Now, Brian, if you were to go on Wikipedia and look up the Arian heresy, you would scarcely be able to believe your eyes because this was a huge argument over the nature of the Trinity, right? And specifically, the argument championed by Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria was that the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, derived from the Neoplatonic Trinity. Notice that Bishop Athanasius comes from Alexandria, and this was also the hotspot of the Neoplatonists, right? Porphyry, Plotinus. The female philosopher and mathematician Hypatia all these people lived in Alexandria in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And this was the moment where they created the Book of Magic, the Corpus Hermeticum, that later would play a huge role in the Renaissance. We'll get to that in a later podcast. But Bishop Athanasius was the Eastern Greek Church, right? In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire had split into Eastern and Western. And the Eastern Roman Empire was administrated from Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And Bishop Athanasius said that his major thing was the Trinity has always existed, right? Even though there's a Father and a Son in there, they're always co-substantial, right? It's not as if one begot the other. And Arius, another Alexandrian, said that makes no sense at all. I got to explain this to people. Christianity is looking for converts at this period in its history. I got to explain this Trinity thing to people. It's hard to explain that we're monotheistic but have 3 gods, and look, if it's a Father and a Son, we can say that the Father begot this. The Father has to have begotten the Son, even if it happened before there was such thing as time, right? Notice the theme of time is back up here. It has to be the case that the Father came before the Son. People died over this. It was a huge controversy, and Constantine was looking. The Roman Empire was in a state of decline, and there were paroxysms of economic problems, and he was just looking for some political unity. That's why he decriminalized Christianity finally, and only to have this bizarre Arian heresy ripping his empire apart. And so they held the Council of Nicaea, and they said, "Look, we're just gonna declare Arianism a heresy, right? And we're just gonna bring the Trinity into the Catholic Church," and it would stay there for 800 years. We can get into Thomas Aquinas, the medieval monk, and his contribution later. But the point is that it was even after the Council of Nicaea, Constantine he was looking for unity, and he was willing to forgive Arius' heresy, and he was even on the day that Arius died. Right, Constantine was bringing Arius back into the church when Arius died a horrible death on the streets of Constantinople. I have the actual quote here. So this is from Socrates Scholasticus, who was an enemy of Arius. So recognize that you're reading the testimony of someone that really hated someone who really hated Arius. Here is the death of Arius, grisly. So buckle up. It was then Saturday, and Arius was expected to assemble with the church on the day following, but divine retribution overtook his daring criminalities. For going out of the imperial palace, attended by a crowd of Eusebian partisan-like guards, he paraded proudly through the midst of the city, attracting the notice of all the people. As he approached the place called Constantine's Forum, where the column of porphyry is erected, a terror arising from the remorse of conscience seized Arius, and with the terror, a violent relaxation of the bowels. He therefore inquired whether there was a convenient place near, and being directed to the back of Constantine's Forum, he hastened thither. Soon after, a faintness overcame him, and together with the evacuations of his bowels protruded, followed by a copious hemorrhage in the descent of the smaller intestine. Moreover, portions of his spleen and liver were also brought off in the effusion of blood, so that he died almost immediately. The scene of this catastrophe is still shown at Constantinople, as I have said, behind the shambles in the colonnade, and by persons going by pointing the finger at the place. There is a perpetual remembrance preserved of this extraordinary kind of death.
Wow.
Grisly. At any rate,
I've had some, loosening of the bowels, but never quite like that.
yeah, imagine like liver, part of your spleen, and your whole lower intestine. I mean, that is just. Now, he may have been. The man may have been. Socrates may have been overstating the case here to really make the death of Arius. Like Constantine reportedly had his doubts. He had welcomed Arius back into the church after the incident of the Arian heresy, only to have him apparently struck down by God on his way to rejoin the main Catholic Church. That gave him, he was like, maybe the gods really don't like this Arian heresy after all. But the point of the matter is that Neoplatonism had a huge impact on Christianity, to the point where, as Will and Ariel Durant write, St. Augustine disliked Greek and never mastered it or learned its literature, but he was so fascinated by Plato that he called him a demigod and did not cease to be a Platonist when he became a Christian. His pagan training in logic and philosophy prepared him to be the most subtle theologian of the church.
And wait, so what happened to the Arian heresy? Like after Arius, shot his brains out, did they still integrate them or
no? The Nicene Creed, which is still recited before every Catholic and Anglican and Presbyterian service all over across the land, is still recited to this day. I got an excerpt of it right here. The Nicene Creed, it says, "I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, born of the Father before all ages, God from light, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father." Right. This is Constantine in 325. Right. This is the Nicene Creed, and so it was a heresy to believe in Arianism for 1,000 years.
Well, it sounds like foul play to me.
Yeah, it really shows the irony that Christianity started out as this rebellious opposition to imperial power, but the moment it got imperial power, it turned and started persecuting pagans, just like pagans had persecuted Christians for all those centuries. And they wiped out. There was a Christian holocaust of all pre-Christian thought in the West, to the point where the works of Plato were lost for 1,000 years. In Alexandria, the great library of Alexandria was burned. The aforementioned philosopher Hypatia was murdered in the streets. It's so interesting that Christianity took so much from Platonism and then turned around and persecuted heavily Neoplatonists. It's the central irony, of the central irony of the establishments, the power structures throughout history. They start out as rebellious, then they themselves become corrupt, and there's a whole life cycle to it. And I think I do have to close the loop on this concept of time here, so we can get back to the mechanics of magic. Right? I want to go back to this idea of your shadow on the sidewalk. And I think in this week's essay, I've invoked the character of Peter Pan, because Peter Pan is a man who's constantly at odds with his shadow. You may recall that his shadow is always running away, and that how he first meets Wendy, she has to stitch his shadow back onto him. Right. So just imagine if your shadow was woke up and had its own consciousness, right? And now you go to hand your shadow an apple. And the thing I want our listeners to appreciate here is that a shadow is flat. It's got length, it's got height, and it's got width, but it's got no depth, right? So Peter Pan's shadow is entirely two-dimensional. It is flat. And so that the shadow pan could only perceive one infinitely thin slice of the apple at a time, right? In order for Shadow Pan to create a mental model of that apple being a spheroid instead of a circle, you would have to look at a bunch of cross sections in the way that an MRI machine can only look at your body as a series of thousands of slices, right, Brian? And it's only by looking at all of the slices could you get a feeling for the actual shape of your body, right, the physical shape of your body. And so what we have here is a two-dimensional Shadow Pan could only appreciate time only appreciate the apple one thin slice at a time. And that's just the way that we perceive time. Anytime you're having to perceive a series of slices, like a animation flip book. You know that you're perceiving a physical dimension. You know that you're getting data from a higher dimension, right? So all this is to echo Plato's point that we obviously live near the bottom of a dimensionality well, and that this 3D, our 3D bodies, or our identities of our identities as individuals are tied to this illusory way that we perceive the universe, right? So, I think the fact that Plato specifically invokes dimensionality really tells that you can really unpack that. It explains why Plato was obsessed with sacred geometry, right? This man had his Platonic solids. Remember them, Brian? He was obsessed with certain solids because they had recurring numbers of vertices, or recurring numbers of angles or corners, and recurring numbers of faces or edges. And because he really believed that this physical reality is like a reflection of some, or a projection of some higher reality that we can only perceive with our minds. And that's really interesting when you start to think about Newtonian physics. Like Newton was an alchemist, as mentioned by Mitch in that last clip, or 2 clips ago. It's fascinating that so many of the elements of Renaissance magic came directly from Neoplatonism as an underground tradition persecuted by the church, and that science came out of Renaissance magic but totally left the magical insight behind, that this world is an illusion. And now the descendants of Renaissance magicians are preaching a materialist worldview, just as the Christians in the Middle Ages, the Christian authorities in the Middle Ages were projecting. Were projecting a self-serving worldview, one that was self-serving to them economically. That's what we have now. I think that the priesthoods of science have been corrupted, just like the priesthoods of the Middle Ages, and that they have discovered that this reality is an illusion, and that they can't announce it. So that's where I think we're at with magic. We are now 50, 60, 70 years past that realization, and that's why I think so many people are popping up on the podcast circuit saying, maybe we ought to take a look at the history of magic. It's not just crazy people. From Platonism to Neoplatonism to Hermeticism to Renaissance magic to modern science, there is a genealogy to be traced there, and it seems like modern science with its placebo effect and this double slit experiment has stumbled upon it. And just because of the presuppositions it makes, is now like T-Mac says, the sciences now exist in a state of unrecognized tension. They can't exactly admit that the materialist worldview is wrong, but that's what our experiments are showing us. So, that was my long-winded message on the history of magic there, Brian. Any commentary from you before we dive into the next clip?
Well, you're sort of laying the framework, though, that sort of explains. The allegory of the cave, it kind of provides the framework in which you can sort of understand the way that magic might work, I guess.
Yeah. And the impact on Christianity is incalculable. And so it's interesting that we live in the sort of cultural milieu we now live in with respect to the religion and sciences and authority. It's wild stuff. All right, so the next clip here to set it up is going to be the one in which our friend Mitch is going to talk about unflinching perseverance. I just like this one because it's an allegory that his story is a little bit weak. It doesn't necessarily show, as you observed earlier, Brian, before we started rolling. It doesn't necessarily show it's not like an example, a knockdown example where you would say, yes, definitely retrocausality is possible. But it kind of shows how retrocausality could work. And, I just liked his point about perseverance, which you'll hear momentarily.
Now, I'm very interested in the philosophy of G.I. Gurdjieff, the esoteric philosopher. Okay, so Gurdjieff, he was a man of such gravity, and he went through so much in his life, and so did his students, that when he says something simple, I always say to people, when it gets really simple, that's when you really start listening very carefully, because what would be a nothing throwaway statement coming from someone else is really profound and seismic coming from Gurdjieff. So he said the following. He and some of his followers were based in Russia during the Revolution, Civil War, and they had to flee. They were in trouble. Some of them were connected to the old government and so forth. And so they fled, and they eventually, after making an incredibly dangerous trek across Eurasia, where it was really life-threatening and very unstable, they wound up in Paris. And at a certain point in Paris, they were just busted broke, and they were really, really in trouble. I mean, there was not money for food. This was a grave, grave situation. And Gurdjieff said, I tried everything to earn money. I tried everything. And he said, I was sitting in my room one day and I was right at the brink of despair. I had made every effort. Me and this group of students, we were on the precipice. We were seriously on the brink. And he said, out of nowhere, his mother walks into his room. She had just arrived a couple of days earlier from Constantinople because she was with another group that had been fleeing. And she hands him a handkerchief, and she says, I want you to take this package from me. I've been carrying this across Europe. It's making me sick to be hanging on to this. I can't hold on to it any longer. And he opens it up, and there's this very valuable brooch with a very valuable gemstone in it. And he remembered that back in Russia, he had given it to her in case she needed to use it to buy food or to bribe a border guard or something. And he forgot all about it. He just assumed it had been used in the journey.
Sure.
And he said, literally, he could have gotten up and just danced around the room for joy. They were saved. They were saved. And he said, the thing that I take from this is that, and I'm really reducing his words into something more ordinary, but it's the best I can do. He said, there is a lawful aspect to, and this was his term, unflinching perseverance. Unflinching perseverance. And of course, you hear that from an ordinary person, and sure, it sounds like an expression to go on my coffee mug or something.
Yeah.
You hear it from Gurdjieff. You must stop and listen and sit with that. Maybe, if we do live in a simulation or a multiverse or a black hole or some function of life that we don't understand, which in itself is a given based on what we've learned at this point, maybe unflinching perseverance or perspective or outlook in this unstuck multiverse of infinite events that we live in has a selective feature, has a measurement feature, has a localizing feature.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Perseverance. I like that. Unflinching perseverance. I like that. What Horowitz is saying here, with in a Platonistic context, right? The allegory of the cave, again, the dimensional aspect of it suggests that time, the experience of the physical dimension, like length or width, which we measure with a ruler, and time, which we measure with a stopwatch, are the same thing, right? This is the Einsteinian intuition, right? The understanding that space and time are part of the same manifold. And what we're experiencing as a stream of consecutive seconds really is something that has the same physical manifestation as length, width, or depth. The three dimensions that we perceive with a ruler. So the takeaway here is that when you start thinking about time, dimensions of time and dimensions of physical dimensions and temporal dimensions as interchangeable, well, that means that your childhood still exists in some sense, right? Your childhood is still out there somewhere, and your old age is out there somewhere. And even more to the point, once you get out of your own individual ego, like your ancestors are all lined up behind you, and your descendants are all lined up before you. So if you start thinking about time as the other parts of your old age, your old man lying on your deathbed, and your first day of kindergarten, those two events still exist in some sense, though they're hidden around a corner of time that's merely a trick of perception. They still exist nonetheless. And so what Horowitz is saying is that there is a connection between you and your childhood self, Brian, and a connection between you and you on your deathbed and every moment before and after, and that even though those connections are hidden behind the same corner of time, but that they still exist and are able to be, and we can detect them in our statistical measurements, like for example in the experiment that Horowitz alluded to on the clip before this last one. So that's really it. That is once you start thinking that way, it starts to make sense that things that happen in the future and things that happen in the past both impact the present rather than just one impacting the present. So I thought it was very interesting. Yeah. Any thoughts from you, Brian, before we roll the last one?
Yeah, I mean, just that what you were saying there, like the unflinching perseverance basically seems connected to like studying for the test in the future as well as the present to manifest better results on the test, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't cut the clip, but he had a story of some woman who really wanted to land this job, but didn't get the job, and his advice to her was there was some qualitative test, that she didn't do well enough on to get the job. His advice to her was keep on studying, and then like I guess a month or two later, that place called her back and was like, "Hey, we have an even better position for you. Why don't you come on down?" Again, it's an anecdote, and anecdote does not data make, but it's still an interesting story.
Well, yeah, I guess. Let's roll the last clip. Eh?
Yeah. Let's do it.
One of my contentions in the book is that everything. If there's a trigger to the magical operation, it's sexuality. It's the feeling of sexual desire.
Okay.
And there's a practice called sex transmutation, which anybody can use anytime.
Oh, don't tell us to not jerk off.
Oh, no. No, I would never do that. I would never tell anybody not to jerk off.
Okay, great.
It doesn't involve avoidance or sublimation of sex, including jerking off. I would never do that to you.
Okay, I'm in.
Okay, so rest assured. But at times of your own choosing, completely private, when you're feeling sexual desire, wherever you are or whatever's going on, just make the personal election at a given moment, whatever it is, to mentally shift your focus and consciously channel that sexual desire towards some cherished or necessary task, whatever it may be.
Cool.
And I would argue that great salesmen, are doing this all the time without even knowing it. We meet salespeople and we're like, gee, I don't really need this fucking blender, but I kind of like him or her. Or maybe if it's, I know I'm being flirted with, but geez, I'm going to say yes anyway. They're doing it all the time anyway. And I think it goes deeper than just the seduction of another individual, much, much deeper than that.
Cool.
You feel sexual desire anytime, anywhere. You privately sublimate the satisfaction of that desire through a mental shift and focus, and you direct it towards something else, and you will perform with greater acumen, creativity, ability, cognition toward that something else.
Pretty interesting. Intensity of will seems to be the thread here, and I'm reminded of Richard Spence talking about a pep rally as an example of a intentionalized will or a ritual where you have that pep rally and you burn an effigy of the other high school's football player and you really get all vociferous and excited and hope that maybe somehow, some ways you can, nudge a little bit of battlefield luck to go the way of your lads on the gridiron, as opposed to the other team with their own opposing pep rally trying to just push the odds in their favor just a tiny bit.
Well, obviously, sexuality is like fundamentally based on attraction.
Yeah.
And, Joe Dispenza, who we were talking about maybe 10 or so podcasts ago, we were going in on pretty deep. And obviously there's something about attraction that's very fundamental, and obviously your sexuality is closely tied to. And yeah, it's just funny. What is it that how do you attract someone so they want to buy your blender, as he's saying there? And what is it that makes people attractive, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, I can see how channeling your sexual energy to sort of try to attract the reality you're looking for. It's such an innate feeling, and it seems like there's definitely some meat on that bone.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I don't quite know what I make of it either, but I will. Yeah, saying that, but that does feel like there's a spot of meat on that drumstick. I agree. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I'm super excited about. I can see there's a pathway opening here wherein I just we talked about magic a lot, and I just wasn't really beyond the idea of sacrificing a goat. I just had really wasn't sure how to do it, and I don't know. I'm super excited to read Mitch Horowitz's book there,
yeah.
And so I'm definitely gonna do that, and hopefully we'll have some exciting stuff to report back. But yeah, I mean, like the law of attraction. It seems like a super fundamental. People talk about it a lot, and like how to execute on that is obviously what Joe Dispenza is talking about. And hopefully we can get more on that, eh?
This is just the people that talk about that. We're talking about it. The Joe Dispenzas, the Mitch Horowitz. These are just the people that I would have mocked relentlessly circa 2005. It's interesting how things come full circle, I guess, eh, Brian?
Yeah.
Well, it's always the case in all times and places that the political revolution or the economic collapse, that's when the whispers of magic start to come in from the lunatic fringes of society. So I guess we can count ourselves, Brian, amongst the lunatic fringes, because here we are bleating about magic on the Old System Failure podcast. But I do think that a reconciliation with Platonism, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, alchemy, Renaissance, all of that stuff, I think I think that those folks are always pushed to the margins by power, right? The people who make money off us going to work would like us to continue going to work. They don't want us achieving self-transcendence. They don't want us realizing that this reality is not but a shadow puppet show on the wall of some cave, right? They want us in our desks, making them where we make them coin. And so in all times and places, the magical insight is combated by the forces of temporal power, and that's what the persecutions of the Christians were. It's what the persecutions of the Bacchic cult was 200 years before Christianity. It's what the Inquisition was, and it is what is happening now. And so it's one hell of a time to be alive.
Yes. All right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's all super exciting stuff. Yep. I don't know. Yeah, I'm going to definitely read his book, and hopefully we'll have more exciting stuff to report here. I was going to read a different book of Mitch's going back that talks more about Renaissance magic. So maybe we'll both be, in a couple podcasts, we'll both have read a Mitch... I keep wanting to say Mitch Hedberg. Mitch Horowitz. It's Mitch Horowitz. We'll both have read a Mitch Horowitz book, and maybe we'll be able to comment even more intelligently on the auspices of magic, eh? Yeah. Well, that's fascinating stuff. But, I mean, I don't know. Well, we talked about magic on this podcast, and then we've manifested this Duncan Trussell interview with old Mitch Horowitz there. In addition to the snowstorm. Well, it's a sign from, the Lord Jesus himself. Yeah, that's the only way to interpret it. I agree. Yeah. Alrighty, Brian. Well, this is usually the moment when I encourage our intrepid System Failure listeners to make their way over to systemfailure.org. There you can find a weekly essay written by yours truly. Each and every Monday, there's a fresh one dropping. The one that's coming out this week is, of course, about Neoplatonism. You can tell I was charged for that particular subject. Over at systemfailure.org, you can enter in your email address and sign up to receive those cracking weekly emails to your inbox every single week, every single Monday. That way you won't have to worry about ever missing one. And additionally, if you'd like to get in contact with either Brian or myself, that feat can be accomplished over at systemfailure.org as well. You wouldn't want to miss out on being able to manifest, weather events and other some such. So you'd best subscribe, huh? It's all happening at systemfailure.org. All right. Well, thank you for that consummate advertisement, Brian. And with that, we'll wish our listeners a fantastic week. We'll be back to you next week.